With constant balance updates, it can be easy for the developers to overlook many of the game systems, which is why we are going to be breaking down the best money glitches currently in the game. Players should bear in mind that many of these are server dependent, and more still, rely on very specific builds. But with that out of the way, let's get started. For our first money glitch, you'll want to research your server's mint, or wherever your currency is made. Many of these places will let players buy special coins on demand, which can be bought for exactly their face value. What's more, some of these mints will actually offer free shipping with these purchases, which is the most important part of the glitch. This will allow players to continuously spend money without their actual money count ever decreasing. This might seem like a useless gimmick, but using some clever build modifying items, this can be insanely strong. Most banks within the game will offer players rewards cards, which will usually generate the airline miles alternate currency per dollar spent. These can then be redeemed for exclusive rewards on their own progression track. By being able to buy an equivalent amount of money with one of these rewards cards, players are able to farm unlimited airline miles without their money count ever going down. The only downside to this method is that it can often take a while for the money to be shipped to the player's location, meaning it has a fairly long cooldown. For our next method, players will need to have spec'd moderately into the nature class. Under the animal tamer subclass, players are able to train the low-level homing pigeon, which can be easily taught to return to a specific location. Training homing pigeons only takes around 8 weeks of light grinding to reach an acceptable level, after which, they can be sold from anywhere between $50 to $1,000. What the game doesn't tell you, however, is that if you train them to return to the player's home, players are able to resell the same pigeon multiple times, giving you a pretty easy money farm. Players should keep in mind that a high charisma stat will be needed to convince buyers that these animals that notoriously never get lost just happen to keep getting lost after purchase. In fact, one of the reasons not many people know about this glitch is because players in the nature class primarily spec into athletics and fortitude, as charisma is generally considered a dump stat. With this in mind, however, those looking for a more unconventional playstyle might find this build particularly enjoyable. This next method is open to players in the education skill tree who are just starting to make their way down the university track. In many servers, student players will be able to apply for interest-free loans, which are designed to allow players to afford common items while grinding the education quest line full-time. With this in mind, if players can find alternate sources of money generation, this can be a very lucrative opportunity for free money. By exploiting a base finance ability available to all players, education mains can then put this money into a high interest bank account, which has the special perk of generating money over time. Assuming that the loan doesn't need to be paid back before the 10-year mark, and that the interest offered is a respectable 6%. Players can expect to farm just over $8,000 after paying it off. Quite unfortunately, this method is heavily region dependent and won't pay off until the start of the mid-game. Our fourth method today can generate crazy amounts of money in a relatively short amount of time, but players are required to do a ton of setup to make it work. The first step is to respec into the political skill tree. This will likely be difficult for most players within the game, as not only are there limited spaces, but the role has increasingly shifted to a pay-to-win model. Players who spec hard into intelligence may also struggle in this role, as depending on your voter demographic, having a high intelligence stat can sometimes cause a debuff on your election meter. With this in mind, it's generally best to invest hard into charisma, and then round out your other skills later into the skill tree. Once players finally grind their way into the higher levels, they'll be able to start making some serious money, and this is all thanks to the stock trading mechanic. Contrary to popular belief, high intelligence finance mains don't have the strongest skill tree to make best use of the stock trading system. This is all thanks to political mains having access to the insider trading skill, which will periodically give players helpful hints for which stocks are about to gain or lose value. This can be through the overpowered friends in high places perk, But as political mains are literally changing the meta in real time, they're also able to know which playstyles are going to be most relevant in the very near future. Many non-political mains have called for this exploit to be removed from the game, as because the stock trading mechanic operates on a zero-sum system, politician mains are essentially able to take money directly out of their voters' inventories and place it into their own. Of course, the best part about this strategy is that political mains such as yourself are the only people with the power to rework such a system, meaning you're safe to use this exploit as many times as you please. This next method is fairly easy, but it involves living within a region concerned with nerfing violent crime. Oftentimes, law enforcement factions will reward players by trading in firearm items, as they are usually considered too overpowered in most criminal subclasses. Usually, the rewards offered for trading are less than what the firearms are worth, but if the player is able to make their own weapons at a low cost, players could use this as an unlimited money generator. Players have found that by using a low-level 3D printer, it is possible to simply craft low-tier firearms at a very low cost before trading them for the reward. Using this one method, one player traded 110 home-crafted firearms for a total of 21,000 currency, and even though it took a series of charisma checks to get paid, the player eventually left with much heavier pockets. As each law enforcement department handles their policies differently, players will need to read the patch notes to find out if this exploit is still possible on their server. This next technique is actually pretty common, but it first involves players to spec hard into the entertainment category, and more specifically, the YouTube creator subclass. Players will then have to select gaming as their primary topic, before then pumping out as many videos as possible. At this point, you'll be looking for a random event to spawn in, which involves a bit of RNG, but after a channel gets large enough, the spawn becomes guaranteed. You'll then be able to be sponsored by Raid motherfucking Shadow Legends. When most people think of Raid Shadow Legends, they often consider its 800 unique champions, its large cornucopia of bosses, or that it's often considered to be the Citizen Kane of the mobile gaming world. These are all true and real things, but most people probably aren't aware of Raid's newest features. You're probably familiar with the game Kiss, Marry, Kill, and this can also be applied to Raid's 800 champions. Personally, I'd want to kiss Scylla, because I have a thing for toxic redheads, kill Masked Fearmonger, because he's definitely committed his fair share of felonies, and marry Siffi the Lost Bride, because I'm a cheap bastard, and she's already picked out a wedding dress. Beyond this new feature, Raid is getting into the spirit of Spooktober by introducing the Raid Yard. From now until November 10, simply download Raid Shadow Legends using the links below, copy your in-game player ID, and then venture over to raidyard.plarium.com to dig yourself some frankly bonkers rewards. These range from epic and legendary champions to 20 grand worth of Amazon gift cards. Existing players can also use the same link to score themselves a special code for a small in-game gift, a well-deserved treat. If this isn't tempting enough, then viewers who are lazy like myself can simply scan the QR code on screen to get the epic champion knight errant, as well as a few handy items like energy refills, a skill tome, and an experience booster. Raid Shadow Legends, the greatest game since sliced bread. Although business mains miss out on the best stock trading skills, this doesn't mean they don't have some impressive exploits of their own. Unfortunately, this next method requires being the head of a mega business, which either necessitates players to build one from scratch, or 100% the corporate ladder quest line. The most important part of this method, however, is that the business itself needs to be seen as vital to the public good. This can be anything from airlines, logistics, or banking. Now that you're in charge, the hard part is over, and it's finally time to reap those rewards. Players in this position are going to want to make as many risky high reward investments as possible, spamming these decisions on cooldown. At this point, one of two things will happen. Either your risky decisions have paid off, and your company is in a much better position than before, or the business is in the first stage of the bankruptcy condition. If this happens, however, players don't need to worry, because as previously mentioned, you chose a business which is classified as vital to the public good. This means that if a business is large enough, it will trigger the too big to fail condition, which will force the server's government faction to compensate the business in order to keep functioning. How this works is because you've essentially taken over a company which is more or less treated as critical infrastructure. It would be far more expensive to let your business die as opposed to just giving you the money to keep operating. Of course, there's a risk that these government factions may acquire your business outright, after which it will become a faction asset, but most factions usually prefer to not own such businesses, meaning this method is considered safe in the current meta. Players should keep in mind that this technique won't work unless the failure of the company would cause widespread harm to the entire faction, meaning smaller businesses will not be able to make use of this exploit. This next method isn't going to be easy, as it requires a team of players with very specific builds to pull off. Firstly, you're going to want to farm as much money as you can. This can most easily be done through the business class, so viewers who want a guide on this playstyle can leave a comment down below. The next step is to find an entertainment main, more specifically, a player who's spec'd into the artist subclass. The artist player will then have to create a painting, which ideally has a distinct and recognizable style. After they're finished, you're then required to buy the painting privately, which will set its value condition to hidden. Step 2 is to find a few other players. These players can be pretty much anyone, but they'll need to look as if they belong in the art world. This can be done with a few points in creativity, or by simply equipping a few specialty items. The next step is to sell the painting. This should be done as publicly as possible through an art guild, who will be willing to auction the painting on your behalf. During the auction, however, you're going to want to coordinate with these additional players to place bids to keep driving up the price. When the bidding is over, however, you'll simply pay the cost of the painting on your friend's behalf, which, as a reminder, will be paid straight back to you anyway. At the end of this process, disregarding a small commission to the art guild, your new painting is now worth exponentially more than from when it was first purchased. All of a sudden, a painting you may have bought for $500 is now worth $100,000, even when the painting itself hasn't changed its rarity at all. Players should keep in mind, however, that just because it was bought for such an amount doesn't mean it will sell that high to another player, but for the purposes of this exploit, you won't have to sell it at all. In most servers, players are able to donate paintings to public art galleries, and for tax purposes, this is seen as a charitable donation. This means that if a player donates their recently revalued painting, in the eyes of their government faction, they made a $100,000 donation. Assuming a player grinded $100,000 that year, their taxable income would therefore be $0, entirely mitigating the tax requirement without having to play through the incarceration questline. The best part of this method is everyone involved in this exploit is incentivized to not report anything to the developers. The artist player is now able to sell their paintings for far more than they could before. The art faction made an easy commission from the sale, and the art gallery essentially got a free, highly valuable painting from a very generous donor. There is of course a small amount of RNG involved in this method, as tax agencies can sometimes apply the audit status effect to the player, but as data miners have pointed out, wealthy players are far less likely to be audited, which makes the discovery of the exploit very unlikely. These have only been a handful of exploits that players can use within the game, but if viewers have others they'd like to share, feel free to throw them down below. Until next time, have fun and embrace the bullshit.